Hey, here we go. All right. While we wait for attendees to stream in, welcome everyone to this webinar series on smallholders and the big challenges that they are facing in Southeast Asia. This is the third panel of this spring webinar series. So over the past couple of weeks, we have talked about, who is a smallholder in Southeast Asia, how, the different ways in which we can define what a smallholder is and what they do and how their lives are changing. We've looked at smallholders and how they've been, their livelihoods are also coming to be intermingled with the migration and labor issues. And today, we will be talking about human-animal conflict, cooperation, and conservation. So putting this in the context of, Southeast Asia that's been undergoing a lot of development that also goes into these areas that animals have lived in. And this has kind of created fragmentation of animal habitats across the region, and that then changes the dynamics between humans and animals and brings humans and animals into new forms of conflict. So the management of these issues are obviously very complex. They have to do with very complex policy, conservation measures, smallholder livelihoods, and very different ways of life, and very different animals as well. So today we've got a really exciting panel lined up for us today. We've got three excellent panelists. We have Wisesjindawat-Fink from Michigan State University. We have Daniel Quist, also from Michigan State University. And we have Megan English from the School for Field Studies based in Siem Reap in Cambodia. So super excited to have all of you here with us today. And the way the panel will work as it has is that I'll pose a series of questions to you all, and then we'll go around and have a conversation about these issues around human-animal conflict. So to kick us off, I am going to ask all of you to give us an introduction to yourself and the work that you do. And also talk a little bit more about how the smallholders or communities that you have worked with, how have they traditionally kind of coexisted with the sorts of animals that you are concerned with? So Lisa will be talking more about fish, Daniel will be talking about water buffaloes, and Max will be talking about elephants. So I think we've got a really exciting discussion ahead. So Lisa, do you want to get us started?
Sure, yeah, please allow me to share my screen. And hi everyone. My name is Wisesjindawat-Fink. I'm a postdoc fellow of the Mekong Cultural Project at Michigan State University. And my background is environmental geography, which describes the human relationship with the environment. And I believe that my research experience is connecting to this webinar very well. And through decades of my work with communities on the Mekong River as a researcher and community development work by using mixed method research, including participatory approach and geospatial technologies. My research contributes to promoting community advocacy with the aspect of promoting local communities' voice, being part of decision-making process, and heard by policymakers, which aligns with one of the goals of the Mekong Cultural Project, which is funded by Lux Foundation. And through many years, fishers are my teachers and co-research process. Fishers hold situated knowledge of their livelihood and fish, As you may see on the main figure, their drawing of cultural ecology of the village in Pak Yam. Fisher taught me how to fish. They taught me how to catch a fishing net, even visually identify fish species and sex. The picture on the right is me showing my nature classroom is on an old wooden boat on the Mekong River. And believe it or not, I caught one fish on that cast as well. And I feel so grateful that fishers allow me to be in part of their livelihood and their life. Connecting to the theme of this webinar, I would like to talk about the triangulated relationship between fishers, fish, and rivers, and challenges that alter their relation that have learned from field survey last month in Thailand and through my years of research experience in the Mekong region. And many times when I ask fishers, how do you become fishers? The simple answer was, when I woke up, I see the river. From here, it shows how the river interconnect closely to fishers in their daily life. It is like a case of Paul Kam or Mr. Kam at Pak Yam village in Songkhram River. And Songkhram River is a tributary of the Mekong River in the northeast of Thailand. He has lived at Pak Yam village since he was born. He has been a fisher for over 40 years. He learned how to fish from his grandfather between the age of 7 or 8 years old. He was out on the boat with his grandfather almost every day. Becoming fishers is an easy choice, but hard living. They learn from their relatives as children and learning from friends. With time and experience, each generation adds situated knowledge through personal observations of the river and fish during the different seasons. Their situated knowledge plays a vital role in helping them to understand the navigation's route in the river characteristic, which Thai appear to be used, or where to fish, or where is the best place to catch. And all these characteristics are fluid and change not only with the seasons, but also time. At Pak Yam village, where Yam and Songkhram rivers meet approximately 100 kilometers from the Mekong River, which is you can see by the arrow that will link it to the pictures of the village. And so fishing used to be a main income of community. There is an old saying along Songkhram River that น้ำมาเอาปลามาฝาก น้ำหลากปลาก็จากไป which means when the water rise, fish comes. When water recedes, fish go. Before the fishing season starts, some fishers who believe that strong spirits live in the river, they recite their sacred vows to the river guardian spirit for permission and good luck to catch a lot of fish. They will vow to the river guardian spirit with flowers, incense, and candle, and tie them in front of their boats. Some traditional ways of praying before fishing, they respect to the spirit by washing their faces with river water. Some may pray like ขอกินขออยากขอปูขอปลาขอให้ได้นะพ่อ which means I ask for permission to eat, ask for food, ask for crab, ask for fish. Please let me have it. The spirit guardians. In the beginning of the rainy season, around May, June, or July or August, the Mekong River floods into Songkhram River. The river runs fast. It's full of red sediment and big school of migratory fish from the Mekong River. Local and migratory fish will habitat and spawn in the lower Songkhram basin, so-called the womb of the Mekong River, similar with the Toresap in Cambodia. This season is a preparation state for fishing. Fishers will not fish due to the strong current, water current. Their gear may tear or be flooded away by the strong current or floating debris. Fishing seasons will begin in the rainy season around September to October. Water level and currents are suitable to install big gears, which as you can see in the middle of this figure show a troll net fishing on rafting boat. And during the dry season around November to April, water flows slowly. Fishers will change their fishing gear that suit the river conditions. You can find in the orange box or on the lower right that on top, fishers will place drift netting to trap fish by building fish shelter with aqua plant on the water surface, similar with grapau in Tolesa. And the lower figure, fisher will install a vertical bamboo fish trap along the river bank, which is the height is allowed 2 meter height. I mean, to conclude from here, fishers have traditionally coexisted with their riverhood environment and fish. Their ways of fishing practice shows a greater responsibilities of their environment in a sustainable manner. Yeah, I think I will pass it forward to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Risa. Daniel?
Hello, everybody. I'm going to pull my slides up before I introduce myself. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Daniel Ahlquist. I teach in James Madison College, which is the Residential College of Public Affairs here at Michigan State, where I have the good pleasure of working with WiSA on the Mekong Culture Well project. But the work I'll be talking about today is some work I've done, some ethnographic work in some Akha communities in northern Thailand. I've worked in the region off and on since about 2009. Between working in an interdisciplinary college and then collaborating with people from so many fields on these cool collaborative projects, I'm starting to lose track of exactly what it is that I do. But if I had to say, I would say I'm a political ecologist. So the work I'll be talking about today is in 2 Akha communities in Chiang Rai province in northern Thailand. And I began this work as part of my dissertation research in 2009. That work focused on state forest conservation, agrarian change, migration, and changing forms of inequality. And I still continue some threads of that work today. My work doesn't focus explicitly on human-animal relationships, but it's something that I've been paying attention to for a long time, and it's always captured my interest. And so when I was invited to be on this panel, I thought it'd be a good chance to re-engage with some of my notes and explore this a bit further. When I started my field work in 2009, when I started my research in 2009, I noticed that, or since I started my research, I noticed that people's relationships to animals, both wild and domestic, have changed quite a lot. And the animals that have really captured my attention are water buffalo. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So to the question of how communities have coexisted with or lived with these animals, for generations, water buffalo have been a fixture in Akha and many other highland communities in northern Thailand, where the water buffalo provided their labor to plow rice fields, which they also fertilized with their manure. They served as stores of wealth, status, and buffers against risk. And they offered their bodies, though likely not willingly, for sacrifice and feasting during holidays and other important events in the villages. By all accounts, water buffalo are very mild-mannered, so older children were often tasked with shepherding them during the day. Anthropologist David Feingold, who conducted ethnographic work in Akha communities in the 1960s, told me stories about villagers raising cows and buffaloes to sell in lowland markets. He told me that the cooler weather and the access to abundant grazing lands gave the highland villagers a competitive advantage compared to lowlanders. And at the time, it was impossible for villagers to transport bulky crops like rice or corn down to market. And it was convenient that the cows and water buffalo could walk themselves down the mountain. When I talked to the villagers about this, they said that they also did this and that at the time, some still were doing it. They said that water buffalo were easy to care for. They more or less took care of themselves and fed themselves by foraging in the fallows, dormant fields, and forest. They reproduced on their own, so it was possible to grow your herd. And the amount of money that you could earn by selling buffalo was far greater than the amount you could earn by selling corn or other field crops, and it required a lot less work. But for reasons I'll talk about, by the time I started my fieldwork in 2009, raising cows and buffalo was getting harder to do, and their numbers in the villages were dwindling significantly. In fact, by the time I finished my dissertation work in 2011, they had sold off all of the buffalo. Those who still had cows paid friends and relatives in villages higher up the mountain to care for them. But again, by the time I left, there were no buffalo left in the villages. Most of my story is actually on the next question, so I'm going to go ahead and stop now, and we'll re-engage in a few minutes.
Thank you, Daniel. And then we have Megan, who will talk a bit more about elephants.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I apologize. I haven't actually got any slides of beautiful elephants for you to look at. So I'm just going to talk to you about a little bit about my background. I've been conducting research on Asian elephants since about 2009. And this has involved both captive and wild elephants throughout Southeast Asia. So I did my PhD in Borneo on the wild elephants there on a population of 200 elephants. And then I've done some work in Thailand and now in Cambodia as well. So my main experience has been in looking at foraging ecology of elephants and then how that is related to human-elephant conflict. So just a little bit of a background before I go into sort of addressing that first question. The community that I'm going to be focusing on today are called the Bunong. So in Cambodia, the majority of Cambodians are Khmer, so about 90% of the population are Khmer. And it's estimated that Cambodia's indigenous people, which includes the Bunong, comprises only about 1% of the country's total population. The Bunong people, the majority of them live in Mondulkiri, or in the Eastern Plains landscape of Cambodia, and they are animists with very strong spiritual beliefs and ties to the forests around them. They follow a sort of a subsistence lifestyle where they rely on forest resources for food and for income. Most families used to practice swidden cultivation as their main form of agriculture, where the forest is cleared and burned to establish agricultural land, and then that land is left to fallow after a certain period. And they've shared their lives with elephants, both captive and wild, for many generations, but a shift in perceptions of wild elephants and captive is actually now starting to take place. So I work at the School for Field Studies based in Siem Reap, and my main role at the moment is teaching and supervising student research projects. So what I'll be talking to you about today is really associated with a research project that some of my students have worked on in the past. So addressing the first question, how have communities traditionally coexisted with the elephants? Conflict with wild elephants was quite minimal in the past due to that shifting cultivation way of farming, allowing areas that were previously farmed to re-establish with early successional species and eventually trees and vines that the elephants could then feed on. And the Bunong, they've always shared their lives with elephants, both captive and wild. So they've come across elephants in the wild when they've been collecting their non-timber forest products, but that's never really been an issue. And they've raised captive elephants. So prior to the Pol Pot years, almost every village in that region of Mondulkiri had captive elephants, and the number of elephants owned by the family indicated their wealth as well as their status. And then when the Khmer Rouge came to power, forcing the Bunong people to move, many elephants were then killed by the communists, and also a lot were set free into the forest. And so by the time the Bunong returned to their villages in the late 80s and 90s, the number of wild elephants had declined sharply. And furthermore, conservation efforts were introduced in the 1990s that people could no longer capture elephants from the wild. And the Bunong actually believe it's bad luck to breed elephants in captivity. And so they consider it very much bad luck to breed them in captivity. So considering they can't take them from the wild anymore, that tradition of keeping captive elephants is gradually dying out now. And some of the respondents that we interviewed, they also believe that many of these older habituated elephants that are coming in and crop raiding were once captive elephants before the Khmer Rouge. And hence they show no fear of people, and it's really difficult to find effective mitigation strategies to keep those elephants out of the raiding, out of the crops. So I think that mainly addresses the first question. I'm not sure if you want me to keep going, Leo, if we want to go back to Wisa.
Do you have more to say about how the Bunong lived with Alice? I think we've got, you can go for 1 or 2 more minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, so they really consider them, with the captive elephants, as part of the family. You know, if an elephant gets sick, they perform spiritual sacrifices in the forest and to try and heal the elephant's illness. So there's very much this spiritual tie. If, for example, a captive elephant does happen to breed with a wild elephant, they perform almost like a marriage ceremony for those 2 elephants to take away any bad luck so that the wild elephant spirits aren't angered. And some of the main sort of impacts that are happening now, that with the growth of economic land concessions, mainly in the form of rubber, also increasingly cashew farms as well, and the establishment of protected areas, it's meaning that this swidden and rotating kind of agricultural practice is no longer really possible for Bunong people. And so they have these set farm areas, and the elephants now also, because they are limited in the areas that they can move through because of these ELCs, the Bunong and the wild elephants are coming into more and more conflict. And on the other side of that, there are a number of elephant sanctuaries with captive elephants in the same sort of province. And now the wild elephants are actually coming through and starting to attack these captive elephants. So there's elephant-elephant conflict happening, as well as human-elephant conflict. And it's, you know, in the past, these elephants coming into raid crops and move through closer to human settlements was very seasonally based. And now it's happening all the time, and it's unpredictable. And it's very difficult to try and work out culturally sort of specific or suitable mitigation strategies that the Bunong feel comfortable with, because they have such close ties with elephants. They don't want to hurt them, you know, but perceptions are starting to change now, where they're losing their crops, and it's exacerbating other issues that the communities might be facing. And so it's just getting to a real turning point now with what's going to happen with this human and elephant conflict now. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Really interesting research that is being done here. I think with, you know, all of you, you're kind of talking about these communities that we don't really think about when we're thinking about Thailand or Cambodia. These are communities we often associate with being on the periphery of the nation. So it's really interesting, these dynamics that they have with animals that are so economically important to them, but also really important in terms of the culture, spiritual dimensions of their lives as well. So I think all of you touched a little bit on this, that, you know, things have been changing, these relationships have been changing, and there has been some pressure on these smallholders and these animals that they live with. So that brings us to our second question for the panel. What are some of the drivers of change to these animal habitats, or these changes to the relationships between these communities and animals? And how does this influence competition over resources or incidences of human-animal conflict? And how is this then also impacted on smallholder livelihoods? So we'll go back to Lisa.
Yeah, we'll go back to the same slide, which is so the drivers of changes and challenges, which is I'm talking about to the study site in Pak Yam village, which is you can see where the long arrow here, which is a tributary of the Mekong River. And we often hear about the environmental and social impacts from mainstream hydropower dams on the Mekong River, but not often address impact to its tributaries. For instance, like on the Pak Yam village that I'm talking today, and fluctuating of the Mekong water levels has occurred since the operation of Sayabuli Dam in 2018. It has impacted to Pak Yam village, where Yam and Songkhram River meets approximately over 200 kilometers from Sayabuli Dam. From the top right shows flooded forest nearby Pak Yam village. This flooded forest is a part of the Ramsar site in the lower Songkhram River. The lower Songkhram Ramsar site has declared since 2019 and cover 5 provinces in the northeastern of Thailand, which are Udon Thani, Nong Khai, Bungkan, Sakunakorn, and Nakhon Phanom. And this Ramsar site is the home of freshwater species and more than 50 redfield species from the Mekong rivers resides or habitat in this Ramsar site. The Songkhram River features as a unique wetland ecosystem, which has been compared to Cambodia's Tole Sap. But now the ecosystem is changed, which is, we can see from this slide how fishes to their livelihood and fish and make their knowledge visible through the process of cultural mapping research method. And this is this slide shows the result of cultural mapping that our academic partner of the Mekong Cultural Well Project, Chiang University, conducted last month in Pak Yam village. And cultural mapping is a gateway of promoting process of community engagement. Cultural mapping is connecting through a focus on bottom-up processes for making visible the knowledge of residents or features here, and share topics of narratives, histories, identity, and local practice that bring meaning to places. On these figures, cultural mapping of Pak Yam and emphasis the change of their cultural ecology through time, which is on the left. You can see that Pak Yam village in the past, community is enriching with natural resources, including flooded forests, bamboo, fish, which is, you can see the orange arrow here that they show a giant catfish here on this Songkhram River as well. You can see fishing gears and culture of food here, which is at the bottom of this picture. We see jars of fermented fish that are drawn in front of their houses, which is this one will show the past of cultural ecology of Pak Yam. And while on the right side, which is the change of Pak Yam in the last 5 years. And when features define the change occur, they define with the significantly change of the river, which is the same year that the operation of Sayabuli Dam has started. In the present figure shows Songkhram River dry out. And also you can see that flood pause is disappearing. You can see the color of the river is very pale, fish decreasing, and no migratory fish, giant catfish, show as when compared to the past figure. And another one that no jars of fermented fish. And another thing that you can see on the right side of this cultural mapping, that flooded forest has been affected by encroachment and turns to be rice paddy fields. And I think I can pass this to the next person to talk about the change. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Those maps are really fascinating. Daniel,
Yeah,
over
thank
to
you.
you.
I'm going to try to share my screen again here. Okay. So like Garber and Turner found in Vietnam, I see the ongoing agrarian transformation in northern Thailand as being the biggest driver of the changing relationship between people and water buffalo. But the agrarian transformation, of course, isn't one thing. It's a process driven by many factors, ranging in this case from forest conservation to market integration, education, outmigration, and other factors. So I'll try to be brief here, but I'll outline a few key drivers. So the first and probably most significant is state forest conservation, which essentially crippled the Swidden cultivation systems that had been in practice for generations in the villages. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Thai state embarked on an aggressive forest conservation project, and the formerly shifting Swidden landscapes like this picture here, which incorporated fields with many diverse crops in them, fallows, and forest at different stages of regrowth. The forestry department essentially came in and said, any land with trees on it is a forest, and any fields that you're currently cultivating, that's all you can farm from now on. When it comes to water buffalo, that's significant in a few ways, but probably most significantly is that the water buffalo would graze in the fallows and the forest and the dormant fields. But when the forestry department came in and forest conservation ramped up, it dramatically reduced the amount of available grazing land for the buffalo. Additionally, when villagers realized that they only had the potential to farm a fixed amount of land, it gave rise to de facto private land tenure system in the villages, whereas previously they had a common pool resource system, and it was understood that people could graze their buffalo in various dormant and fallow fields. Because they had no legal land rights, the villagers had to plant all of their land in crops all the time, and so fallows sort of went by the wayside. And also, if all of your neighbors are planting crops on their field, you can't just let your buffalo go and graze in those fields. And so the amount of available grazing land was significantly limited. Additionally, around this time, in the Swidden system, rice was the staple crop, but it was intercropped with many, many other crops, a lot of different vegetables, a little bit of corn, but that rice stalks and things left over was good foraging for the buffalo. But part of this agrarian transformation has been defined by the shift to corn. And so this is what the landscapes look like or looked like during my dissertation research. And so with this shift to corn, not only could you not let your buffalo go in someone else's field because they could potentially destroy the crop, the leftover stalks and stuff in the field after the harvest weren't as good for grazing for the buffalo. So we got to a point where it just was becoming impractical. Little foreshadowing there. It was becoming impractical to keep water buffalo and cows as well, because there were just so few grazing opportunities, and feeding them is simply too expensive. So around the same time, the Thai state, a few years later, maybe around the turn of the century, the Thai state started passing some compulsory education bills that required children to go to school. But because the villages didn't have schools, they had to send their children away. So the children, in addition to the I imagine, huge ruptures in families of having to send their children away, they also lost the labor power of their children. That could be everything from, babysitting younger siblings to helping out in the fields. And one of the things that older children did was watch the buffalo, or they did other work so their parents could watch the buffalo. So this combination of, limited grazing possibilities, labor shortage, the effort and expense of having to watch the buffalo, it became impractical to keep them. So people started selling off their buffalo at that point, but it was still practical to have a few around because they were needed to plow rice fields. But with the arrival of gas-powered hand plows, there was no longer really a need to keep buffalo around. And so by the time I finished my dissertation fieldwork in 2011, there were no more buffalo in the villages. They had all been sold off. Cows are a slightly different story. There are still cows in one of the villages, and the person who owns them spends all of his time herding them. And in the other village, a few of the wealthier people still hold on to some cows, but they pay people higher up the mountain to watch them. So none of the cows actually live in the village. And I'll talk about kind of the significance of what this all means for people in the next question. But for now, I'll turn it over to Megs.
Thank you, Daniel. Megs, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So just before going ahead, I just wanted to address a question that was in that Stephen asked, and it's a very good question, about the burden of providing nutrition for captive elephants by the Bunong people. So gradually over the years, fewer and fewer Bunong are actually keeping their elephants in the village. They're actually renting them out to tourism companies, and in some cases selling them to tourism companies, some of which are good, others not so good for the welfare of the elephants. And so it's very rare to see a captive elephant still in a village. There might be one or two, but it's actually very rare. I know it might get confusing because I'm jumping back and forth between wild and captive elephants a little bit, but we've collaborated with some really high welfare elephant organizations over the years where Bunong mahouts are employed to come and look after their elephants at these tourism sites where people just follow the elephants and watch them forage and behave in very natural ways. There's no riding the elephants or anything like that. I've also seen some very poor quality areas where people will purchase the elephant, and then what happens with that money is that money may go to them buying another elephant or something else, and it's not quite as effective as the rental system. And these sanctuaries that actually seem to be doing quite a good job, they exist on the perimeter of protected wildlife reserves. And this is where the wild elephants are starting to come in more and more and attacking those elephants that are in those areas. So the wild elephants aren't actually going into the villages to attack the captive elephants. They're going into the villages to raid the crops. And that's, like I mentioned before, that's because of this growth in economic land concessions. Unfortunately, the Bunong are really susceptible to land grabbing because they haven't got that paperwork to say that they have ownership of that land. And so often you get these bigger companies coming in, such as rubber and cashew, and taking that land. And this ends up resulting in the elephants being squeezed into these very, very narrow sections of forest where their migration routes are absolutely interrupted. And then they're starting to go into crops, either, opportunistically to feed on the resources that are there as they move through to the next bit of fragmented forest. But over time, these elephants are actually becoming more and more habituated. That resource is there, they know that resource is there, and they just keep coming back. And it's when it gets to that point, it's very difficult to try and mitigate that crop raiding. And so the main drivers of change are these changes in the use of the land, like the economic land concessions, the development of these protected areas where people can't rotate their crops anymore. So that conflict is just happening more and more. I think that's the main thing I needed to mention about that. Yeah, it's just, yeah. So these elephants, once you can have opportunistic raiders that develop into these habituated raiders. And some of the Budong people that we've spoken to in Andong Kralong village, actually, these older elephants that are in their mid sort of 60s, late 60s, are believed to have been captive in the past. They're particularly aggressive and have no fear of fireworks or other techniques that used to be used to scare elephants away. They've just become very used to it, and so it's hard to get rid of them. And so perceptions of people, they're becoming increasingly fed up with not getting any kind of assistance in learning how to mitigate and keep the elephants away. And also their spiritual beliefs contribute a lot into what kind of strategies that they can use. So for example, I mentioned they have these really strong ties to the forest spiritually. They have Nectar, which is like a forest spirits where they worship areas of forests, and the forests are protected by the Budong because of their spiritual beliefs. This particular village, the herd of elephants that are coming in and raiding all the time, they're often going back into this protected forest that also used to be a village where many people died of illness. And so they think if they go anywhere near that forest, it's going to bring very bad luck to the people in the other village. And so to try and work out a way to mitigate, and the elephants are raiding at nighttime when the Bunong people don't want to go near that forest, but that's where the elephants are coming in from. It's very difficult to try and work out a culturally appropriate way to do this mitigation. And they are not interested in having Khmer people come in and do it for them. They want to protect their crops themselves. They don't want the elephants to be hurt. And coming up with ways to protect crops is it's costly, you know, like you could think electric fences. The farms that the Bunong actually have are often within the protected areas. Some of the villages are within protected areas, and it's very hard to be able to put electric fences around all of these crops because it's just going to steer the elephants to another person's crop. And then they're going to want some sort of compensation for the damage that's happened to their crop. So it's something that we're trying to work on here at the moment, like a workshop where we can develop some of these mitigation strategies. But yeah, in answer to the question in a nutshell, it's just there's less forest resources. As a result, the elephants are having their migration routes blocked. They're coming into the crops now and they're becoming habituated, which means it's harder to stop them.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got really interesting dynamics going on here that are very closely associated with landscape change or changes in the waterscape. So in the case of the Mekong River, you know, it's a transboundary impact of a dam in Laos that we see these impacts affecting fish there. And, you know, on land, we see it closely tied to issues of, you know, student agriculture changing, people's mobility changing as a result of that, land tenure issues, labor issues, intergenerational issues. So yeah, really complex dynamics we're dealing with here. So moving on to our final question. How are smallholders or the communities you work with, how are they responding to these challenges? And, you know, how successful have they been in doing so? I think you've all kind of alluded to some of that already, but I would love to hear more about what you think on this. Lisa.
Yeah. So this is, and again, this is part of my observation and collaborating, working with Chiang Mai University research team last month. And so what I got from my observation so far, that I learned the situation at Pak Yam community, villagers are struggle to live, to survive under degradations caused by Sayabuli Dam without seeing light at the end of the tunnel. which is you can see here from pictures that as the title say, last jar of fermented fish in Pak Yam, and why is the title this way? And when I talk with fishers at Pak Yam, it just turned to be that fishers over there becomes only part-time fishers because there is fewer and fewer fish to catch in the river, and fishers have lost their income from selling fish and making fermented fish. Pak Yam used to be very famous for making fermented fish, which is well known as para or pladek, or which is similar with plahok in Cambodia. And last month, my site visiting at the famous fermented fish making of Pak Yam, in which you can see figure on this slide. It shows number of empty jars of fermented fish are scattering under her house. And there is only one jar left of fermented fish, which is you can see on the upper left of the figure. And also you can see a figure also shows abandoned wooden boats and fishing gears that have not used for years. And some fishers try to survive by becoming sheep laborers in the cities. Some try to becoming rice farmer without skills. The government has provided lands for farming in the flooded area as a subsidy policy. And I remember very well what Pokam, who is a long-time fisher, he told me, I have tried to do farming, but I'm a fisher. I'm not a rice farmer. I don't know how to grow rice, which is when I heard this, he told us it is a heartbreaking story that how he would like to survive in the real life. And from my take, fishers see water and fish as being part of their life, and they are their food, income, rituals, and life. When the river changes its course, it changes their life and changes them to become aliens to their own environment and context. Controversially, why the state see the river as an infrastructure development in which we always have questions. This development is for whom and who gain benefit at the most from this? Is it communities or the states? For the past few decades, the water from the Mekong River and its tributaries has been offered as the main solution to address drought and poverty reductions to the people of Isan and the northeast of Thailand. The state has stated attention to Lower Songkhram River as well, where Pak Yam is on this river. Lower Songkhram River, where is a large tributary water resources without mega hydro dams project constructed yet. When comparing to Pak Moon or Rasi Salai Dam and many more in Isan, the worrying trends of dam construction on Songkhram River are spreading around communities. If there were a dam, make a dam construction on Songkhram River, it impacts over millions of people and ecosystem as a whole, particularly the Mekong River, where the main river receives its source of water from tributaries. And to this end, I would like to end my talk today from Voice of Community. Kruti or Mr. Niwat Roy Keo, who is the founder of Chiang Conservation Group. He was a recipient of the Goldman Environmental Prize last year. And what he told us a few weeks ago, he stated that there are many dam development on the Mekong River. We cannot pause the ongoing construction and all planned dams, including Luang Prabang Dam or Pak Beng Dam. However, we would like to ask the states to revisit lessons learned from the existing dam development, in which the impact of it has further added complications to flow regime of the river and to people who rely on the river. And he ends with, should we stop building further new dams on the Mekong River? Yeah, I think I would like to pass this state to the next panelist. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Isa. Powerful words from Kruti, who has been leading community-based conservation along the Mekong River. Okay, Daniel.
Okay, Wisa, you're a top act to follow. I know that my comments up to this point have mostly focused on the past, but I want to emphasize in my answer here that this is still an ongoing story and it still matters. So while some villagers still wax poetic about their days shepherding their water buffalo, because the water buffalo were never really a central livelihood strategy in the villages, although they were bigger for some people than others, their disappearance in and of itself has not dramatically changed villagers' ways of life. However, when you look closer, it becomes clear that the loss of water buffalo actually did come at a cost, and the kind of slipping away of cows as well. So the first reason, and it's actually the thing that piqued my interest in animals and people's relationships to them, is that the disappearance of buffalo and cows is the loss of a really important buffer against risk. So in the past, a crop failure may have meant you didn't have enough food to eat, and if you had livestock, you of course could eat the livestock. Today, if you have a crop failure or an unexpected illness or death in the family or something else, it can be devastating. You can lose your bulk of your income for the year. You can go into debt. You could risk not being, having to sell your land. And so on more than one occasion, I've seen villagers sell their livestock, and in all cases was cows, in the face of such crises. And while selling livestock is a big hit for these families, it allowed them to stay out of debt, and it meant that they never had to consider selling their land. On the more positive side, livestock are a store of wealth, and so that store can be tapped into when you need it, to buy a house or to pay for your kids' college education. And so I remember one mom of a high school student saying, just smiling the whole time, saying how the plan was to sell all their cows to pay for their daughter's college, which was a huge deal for them. Another impact is the loss of fertility. So when buffalo and cows graze on fallows or on dormant fields, they're converting that unused biomass in the field into soil fertility. Not only the organic matter, but it's stimulating growth of microbial life in the soil. And when they go out into the forest to graze, they return and deposit their fertility on the fields, or it can be put on home gardens. So that loss of fertility of having animals integrated into the system is actually a big loss. And ironically, the corn that they're growing is being sold to animal feed companies that are turning it into livestock feed. So there's this sort of twisted situation up there where they're not able to sustain livestock themselves because they're growing corn for other people's livestock. And then, of course, there's the loss of knowledge and of possibility. And so as these large animals have faded from the livelihoods and land use systems in the landscape, young people aren't learning about these relationships. They're not learning not only what it is to care for them, but how they can be a part of an integrated system. And so, young people have been leaving the villages for decades now. And one of the reasons was that, in addition to having to leave for school, and they're conditioned to see their futures in lowland Thai cities and towns, the villages just weren't very attractive when everybody was growing corn. I had nearly every young person I spoke with said that they wanted no part of being a corn farmer. But now, for a variety of reasons, the forestry department has let up a little bit in some areas. And so in the villages where I've worked, they're starting to integrate more tree crops and perennials. It's becoming a much more integrated agricultural landscape, which is really exciting, and it makes the villages a more pleasant place to be. Young people coming back are telling me, oh, well, maybe I could come back here and live and farm, because it's a more appealing prospect now. So none of them know how to relate to these animals that they've not known in their lives for the most part. But if they want to learn, their parents and their grandparents still do have that knowledge, and I know would be eager to teach them. And there's a growing excitement in the villages about this turn to more integrated agriculture and agroforestry. And that enthusiasm is, I think, really hopeful, and I'm excited to see what they do moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel, for that hopeful note. Megs.
Unmute. Yeah, so basically, given this reported increase that we found with the elephants raiding the crops, there is potential for reprisals and retaliatory killing, which has happened in India, in Sri Lanka, when people's tolerance reaches a certain point. And that point hasn't been reached here, thankfully. And that may be because, it's sort of locally moderated by the traditional Bunong culture, which highly values elephants so much in their livelihoods, in their beliefs, in their spiritual beliefs. And, that significant role that elephants played in Bunong livelihoods prior to the Khmer Rouge, along with their traditions, it contributes to and benefits the protection of the forest and their elephants. But there's a question in the chat saying, asking how these key animal companions, losing these key animal companions is affecting their worldviews, their ideologies. Speaking from what I've learned with the Bunong, they're getting angry. They're losing their sense of identity. Now that that use of having captive elephants, that tradition is dying out. They're losing their tolerance of this species that they've had such love for and has been such an integral part of who they are as a community. The younger generations, similar to what Daniel was saying, the younger generations aren't interested in staying in the village and learning from their elders about this this tradition. They want to move to the city. They want to get an education. They want to get other jobs. So yeah, the main thing is that people are getting angry with the wild elephants. They want solutions. They want help. They're scared. These wild elephants are coming into not just the crops. They often come into the school grounds in one of the particular villages. Like they come in and they'll be in the back of the children's school. They're breaking structures. They're just becoming less and less fearful of people. And something I also just wanted to point out that I think is really important when you're looking at things like tolerance levels of people to wildlife raiding. The timing of when you're conducting interviews can have a very big influence on the responses that you're getting from the interviewees. So for example, we found that if we're interviewing people and their crops have been raided very recently, the responses, people will obviously, they were much more angry. It was much more raw. But we often would find as well that their responses were exaggerated in some ways. And we would verify that by actually going out to the crops that were being raided, and based on what they had told us and how many trees had been damaged and how many elephants had come through, we'd actually go to those crops and see that it was actually much less than what they were telling us. And so I encourage people that are relying a lot on qualitative data collection to also verify some of this with quantitative collection, because yeah, depending, and if the raids had occurred months and months prior, people were like, they were annoyed, but there wasn't that anger and that tangible anger where you just think, oh no, soon something's gonna happen. If whether NGOs, but mainly government, they want the government to help. They want financial aid from the government. They want compensation. They want training for mitigation, before it gets to that point. So I'm sorry that ends on a bit of a negative note compared to Daniel and Lisa, but it's not looking good.
Thank you, Max. Yeah, it's a really complicated situation, and sometimes it's really hard to find. In all the work that we do, it's hard to find solutions to these sort of situations that are driven by these dynamics that are taking place far beyond the village itself, and also by very powerful vested interests that are driving these landscape changes in Southeast Asia. So that's a really difficult problem to solve. So Max, you already addressed that question in the chat directly. Daniel and Lisa, do you have anything you want to add to this question of how the loss of these key animal companions affects people's worldviews and ideologies that often involve like animals and also non-animal beings like spirits, for example? I think you touched a little bit on that, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit more? Lisa, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think I mentioned a bit that when the river change, it caused the river change, it flows, and then it changed features ideology of their life and the context of the river, and I think part of that is which is explained well that for instance, like when the environmental change, and for instance, like it used to be like fisheries, we know their river course very well. They know where the river ecology is. When the river changed its course, and then it's also changed the riverbed characteristic itself as well, which is just turned to be that fisheries they have to learn their new environment with the new context. And actually, so this means that they lost their situated knowledge that they learned through times by these environment changes. And also another thing that I would like to add is there are another topics that when we talk with fisheries last month, and we asked about that the next generation of fisheries, and then how they can how fisheries transfer this situated knowledge to the new generation, which is just turned to be impossible and unlikely that the new generation will become fisheries. First of all, is as we can see that not much fish to catch, and then mostly that the kids will stay in the city and when going to school in the city, which is just seem to be the idea of becoming fisheries could be the end of the generation. Yeah, so which is that is could be a little turned to be insecurity of food, particularly fermented fish. Yeah.
Yeah, in the villages where I've worked, so the villages were both Christian. So traditionally, prior to conversion, in the Aka belief system, animal sacrifices happened, but the Christian villages did not did not really do sacrifice in the same way, although for certain celebrations it was still standard practice to kill an animal and people would eat it. It never went to waste. But what's interesting with the water buffalo, and it's sort of been in the back of my mind, I wasn't sure how to incorporate it into my presentation. The older villagers had knowledge about how to kill a buffalo. And even though it was hard to watch, it was incredibly efficient and as humane as you can get. But there was a moment where there was a village-wide festival and the young men wanted to be in charge and they tried to kill a buffalo and they didn't have the knowledge, and it was a really violent, awful situation. And I think that just speaks to the kind of severing of this relationship that is not only sort of economic or practical, but is spiritual and the intimacy of that relationship of killing an animal and doing it with that sort of, I guess, I don't know if kindness is the right word, but I think that kind of speaks to it. Broadly, the loss of animals, they still have chickens and a few pigs, but in general, the loss of animals has gone hand in hand with this really dramatic agrarian change. And, in one generation, they went from not having roads and electricity and nobody went to school and very few people spoke Thai to suddenly all of the children going away to school, orienting their lives and their futures towards lowland towns and cities, often speaking Thai as their primary language, and some young people from the villages don't speak Akha very well, so communication with parents and grandparents is sometimes difficult. So, in the context of that, I think this relationship with the buffalo gets a little bit lost. But I do think that this turn, and I hope the forestry department is willing to work with villagers on this. I'm not overly hopeful, but I do hope that this turn towards more integrated agriculture and more tree crops and things like that is going to continue, and that sort of the next step in the development of those types of systems is reintegrating animals. So we'll see. I think we can be hopeful. I don't know how likely it is, but we can be hopeful.
Thanks, Daniel. Before I move on to other questions, just a reminder to the audience that if you have a burning question you want to ask, please put it into the Q&A. We would love to hear from you. Okay, so I've got one question here. I think you've all talked a lot about the how these animals have played a really important role in the lives of these communities. But if we kind of flip that around and think about the agency of the animals, in what ways do the animals also kind of use people or communities to their own benefit? How do they kind of show and assert this agency of their own? Anybody want to start?
I can add something.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we all know the important role that many different, keystone species and animals like elephants as ecosystem engineers or ecological engineers, the role they play in the maintenance and the health of the forest. So to be having elephants killed in retaliatory sort of shootings or anything like that from crop raiding, I think would have some devastating impacts on the already very minimal forest that remains, as far as seed dispersal, their maintenance of tropiongs or the water holes, the way that their weight is able to sort of crush down and make those water holes accessible for other species during dry times of the year. I think there'd be a lot of negative ecological implications if wild elephants weren't in that area anymore.
I think thinking about this is something that, as I was putting together my notes for this, I kept it sort of haunted everything, because that question of the agency of non-humans is such a big part of the story. And I've thought about a lot about the soil and the plants, but less about the animals. I think for any domestic animal, they received, protection, and they fulfilled their role in this system, and ideally were kind of shepherded in a way that kept them safe and healthy and whatnot. Obviously, it's a really one-sided relationship in terms of who's benefiting more from it. But it's worth thinking more deeply about. I don't have a good answer except to say that's a really good question that deserves more attention.
Yeah, I agree. It is not not easy questions to answer. It just seemed like I would like to put my shoes in fish, or to put my fin in fish. So think like as a fish, that how actually fish or river benefit from human. But actually, when we're thinking about a relationship for the whole system, is all human and fish and the river, they all connected as a whole, as a same agency. When thinking about the non-animal or non-human as fish, and I do think that if fish will be proud in the way that actually they influence human in terms of food culture, which is like in this village, Pak Yam, very famous in making fermented fish, which is turned to be a very famous food culture. And some this non-human agency as fish that human use or imitate fish culture into their life, beside food, and also into the rituals or festival, and which is that show the image and use fish as a symbol of fertility. And in some time that fishers or human not just like try to think that to think just like to consume fish as food only, but also fishers, have some kind of fish conservation area, which is a way of also try to preserve and conserve fish, how to live in a sustainable manner with the river as well. For instance, fishers has a practice not to fish during spawning seasons. Yeah, for instance, like during in between May, June, July, at that time. Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you all for trying to tackle that very difficult question. I think, yeah, it's really difficult to try to separate like nature, culture, the whole debate. And I think also taking into account that in Southeast Asia, people have very different ways about thinking of these sort of nature, animal, human relationships, like the ideas of tamachat or tamachir, like it's a very different worldview towards approaching these sort of non-human actors there as well. And so Lisa, you just touched on this, but there is a question in the chat also about could you all elaborate a little bit about how does caring for these animals also shape community relationships, and how have the changes you've described in terms of caring for these animals, or the changes that they are facing, how have this changed relationships within the communities you have worked with? I think you all alluded a little bit to that in terms of say with crops and the people kind of having to fence off their fields or having their private land right now, like that kind of affects relationships. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about how these community relationships are also changing.
I'll jump in there just quickly. We found that because a lot of the Bunong villages, they are out staying in little shacks that they have built within their farms, to, you know, when they think the elephants are going to be coming through. And so they're often having very sleepless nights, and this can be happening, it's happening more and more. And so the psychological impacts on the villages is compounding on other issues that they may also be facing, like, you know, loss of income because of the crop raiding or other reasons, loss of access to non-timber forest products in more highly protected zoning systems of a national park. And I think that, yeah, there's some significant psychological impacts that could potentially be happening due to not only the stress of what's going on, but just physically not getting the sleep, having to then work on their farms during the day. Unfortunately, people then rely a lot, maybe more on alcohol to try and get their worries away from them. And then that has compounding effects as well. So yeah, I think the psychological impacts are often overlooked when we look at human elephant conflict. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed a lot more too.
And Max, do you also kind of find tensions in the community in terms of like how they want to deal with the conflict or how they think it should be resolved?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends on, you know, some people who have been allocated farming land in a certain area, they are affected more by crop raiding than someone that's been allocated on the other side of the road or in another area. And they feel like that's not their fault. They've been allocated that land by the government. And so they feel like then there becomes tensions within the community, not because of the community members' faults, but because of the way that the land is being distributed among members. And so those that are affected more feel like they deserve more compensation than those that are affected only a couple of times a year. So there's definitely tensions building, increasingly so within the villages. Yeah.
I think maybe two things come to mind. One is, yeah, the shift from a common pool resource system or something resembling that to a de facto private land tenure system has taken what was sort of a free-flowing sort of, you know, even reciprocal endeavor. People would sort of join forces to herd, or, you know, and they could go on all the land. Now people are protective of their land. You know, there's more sort of boundary enforcement. A lot, you know, some conflicts between villagers arose if animals got into their fields or things like that. So that's one, that kind of protectiveness of land and the conflicts that arise. And then, you know, it's this loss of buffer against risk is actually a big deal because, I mean, not everyone always had there are always people who didn't have livestock. And so there were people who were more vulnerable before. But now the risk taking in the absence of these buffers is not only, you know, putting people in harm's way at times, but it's also when those risks don't pan out and people fall into debt, it's straining relationships between villagers as they're trying to borrow money or not repaying loans. And that's become a bit of an issue, more in one of the villages than the other. So, you know, those kinds of things are at least partly tied, I think, to this change. And then there's just, you know, a handful of men who really miss having buffalo, and that was important to them. And there's a sort of a sense of loss associated with that as well.
Thank you. Lisa, is there anything you want to add to this?
I think I pretty much
Yeah.
stated earlier how is change and impact to their livelihood, right? Yeah.
Okay. So I'm really interested as well in, forms of, I guess, state or non-state actors from outside the village who have there been any kind of, outside involvement in trying to influence these, um, dynamics between the communities and the animals? So I know some of you mentioned like conservation groups, or, Daniel, in your case, I'd be interested to find out why there's this kind of resurgence of interest in, the kind of agroforestry that you spoke about. And for Ariza, I know, there are these community-based conservation groups elsewhere in the Mekong. And is any of that happening in the area that you're working in? Is there any form of assistance or sharing of knowledge across the river basin to try to find solutions to these issues?
Yeah, I can elaborate more for other agencies or other organizations that they are working on. I mean, in the issues on Ban Pak Yam, where is this study site. So Pak Yam, Ban Pak Yam, where is on Song Kham River, as I mentioned earlier, that this river haven't had any mega hydro project of dam construction yet. So just turned to be like a big forgotten discussion at the moment among NGOs, among academics, and in the same way, the government try to think try to create a project on this Song Kham River, and which is, I think it's just turned to be on long-term discussions. And also the main key thing that the NGO that they have been try workings in these days, that they try to promote promote locals' voice into part of public participation of this dam development, which is generally that the government, when they do a kind of projects, they always say that they have conducted public participation, but it just turned to be that what they explain NGO and some information that journalists are exposed. It just turned to be that the government just did just the end of it, but not mean it. They just conduct public participation by conducting survey with a 10 baht for participations or time for villagers, that how they pay to villagers for that. So just collect all numbers of participants for the public participations idea. So I think, I mean, for these Song Kham Dam constructions that as a plan to be or not to be, which is, I think it is still be on ongoing debate. But if it's this project really happen, it will create a big impact in Isan, in the northeast of northeast region in Thailand, and also tributaries, and also the lower Mekong downstream from this part, yeah, which is nearby. I think it's, yeah, just, yeah, I know it's hard.
Yeah, there are many different outside actors influencing the situation in the villages. But this turn to more sort of agroforestry, it's been done through a variety of channels. It's not exactly the same in either village, but in the one village I've mostly focused on, it's been partnerships with some indigenous NGOs. Also, one thing that's important to recognize in northern Thailand is the jurisdictions of different state agencies overlap and conflict in really messy ways. And so you find a situation where one state agency is telling the villagers they can't do something, and another one is saying that they can, and they're helping them do it. And so that's happening as well. You know, they're networking with, you know, various outside actors is really impressive, and they've plugged into global indigenous peoples movements and knowledge sharing systems, and connected with numerous NGOs and academics. So they're really quite efficacious and incredibly knowledgeable. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. But I before I turn it over to you, Megs, I actually want to add to Mingli's good question. If animal rights groups, either inside or outside of Cambodia, have had a say in any of this, and if they're putting pressure either way on the relationships local people have with the elephants. I know in Thailand, there's been a lot of sort of criticism of mahouts and those relationships.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Currently, the circumstances in the village that we've been mainly focusing on, based on our research findings, we then advised WCS about, you know, how these perceptions were changing quite drastically, and that mitigation training or something needed to take place. And based off of that, they employed not a Bunong person, a Khmer person, to be like the touch point or the go-to person if the elephants were coming in to raid the crops. And he was involved in training up some of the Bunong people in the SMART program. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with SMART. It's basically you're recording the GPS location and the amount of damage that's occurred, and that sort of thing. But as far as other ways that organizations have been involved in the issues, there's not been a lot, unfortunately. And also the implications of some of these NGOs coming in and you know, assuming that certain mitigation strategies that work in other places should be utilized here without taking into account those spiritual considerations and the relationships that the people have with the forest that's on the boundary, and the reasons why they don't want to be out along that boundary because of their spiritual beliefs. That's not really being heard at this point. And as part of some of our other studies that we've done in the village, we've tried to record stories like folklore, old folk tales about the human-elephant sort of relationship, so they have that documented for future generations. So it's not lost in that way. But yeah, there's not been a lot of assistance helping with the issue. And in regards to what you just mentioned, Daniel, about the issue of mahouts and that sort of captive elephant culture, and how the animal rights groups frown upon them in you know, in particularly riding camps and that sort of thing. I don't really know where I personally sit with that. It is a difficult one. I've worked with some great organizations where the elephant welfare has been very high, but they do allow some riding. I've worked at and facilitated or been a scientific officer at other camps where they don't allow riding, but they allow some other forms of activities that cause a lot of stress on the animal, but the tourists don't really understand or see that. I think as far as with the Bunong people, and this sort of goes into the question you asked previously as well, Mingli, in the past, they've seen elephants as part of their family. They've treated them as a family member. If they get sick, they treat them with similar sorts of things and similar sacrifices as they would if it was a family member. And so I think, as far as my personal opinion is, I'd love elephants to be in the wild. I think it's very sad for the mahout culture to be dying out because it's so important culturally. But I think it's a good idea that, in a way, is dying out to some extent, in that they can't take calves from the wild anymore, and that they don't believe in breeding them in captivity, and hopefully that wild population can bolster. So at the moment, there's only in that landscape a couple of hundred wild elephants that each of them eat, 200 to 300 kilograms a day. They need a lot of food. They're expensive to look after as well. It's a difficult sort of paradigm, I guess, that mahout captive elephant. And I don't tend to be anthropogenic about things. Like I'm a biological scientist, so I kind of have more of that perspective on things. Rather than, so for me, it's very difficult to try and understand what the elephant's perspective is and how the elephant is feeling being in that captive environment and being considered a family member by the mahout family. I don't doubt that they're loved by those families and well cared for, but is it that in the elephant's best interest? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I have a quick question on and also my observation when I was in the northern part of Thailand in Chiang Mai. There's one project that they try to rehab tourist elephants. So they turn the tourist elephant back home, and then it just turned to be those tourist elephant. They lost their instinct. They cannot live in the wild anymore. I think it just turned to be even wild animals when they turn it to be domestic, and then they cannot go back into their life. They change already, and so I think for that project they have to train that tourist elephant to live with the wild again. Yeah, and then in the beginning of that stage, I mean, mahout have to be with elephant because they are so attaching together. And yeah, I think
that's right. Yeah, it's a very difficult one, and I've heard about that program. I think they're calling it rewilding. There's a lot of different definitions of what rewilding is, right? But yeah, I agree with you. For an animal that's been in the captive environment for most of its life, and then to put them back into the wild, they've missed a lot of developing those learned behaviors. Elephants have so many learned behaviors that they pick up from the herd as they grow up. So if they've been removed from that herd at a young age, there's a lot of behaviors that they don't really know. And they tend to go closer to villages. They don't have fear of people. It can potentially be quite dangerous if the wrong elephants are released into that rewilding. And like you said, they still need to have the mahout with them or nearby, keeping an eye on them because of that, the ability that the elephants non-fear of people and going into crops and all that sort of thing. So, but I think in southern Thailand, I'm not sure around Kanchanaburi, there's been the Queen's Project where they've done some release of captive elephants, and it's been semi-successful. There has been some issues, but I think it's something that could possibly happen in the future. But I think it depends on the individual elephant because they have very different histories, and that's going to influence how well they can adapt to being back in a wild environment.
All right. I think we could go on for a lot longer, but unfortunately we're out of time. And I think, this conversation really highlights the, importance of using these different and creative sort of approaches towards finding solutions for these problems, as navigating this tension of not kind of over romanticizing these relationships that people have when you contextualize it within very modern changes and desires of younger generations. For example, it's about listening closely to the community and using creative methodologies to capture what their worldviews and their perspectives. So I think Lisa, that mapping thing was really, really cool and interesting. And, Daniel, with your ethnographic work, like that, deep integration into, the community is also really important in terms of understanding that all these nuances in the way that they approach these issues. And Max, you use mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods that kind of create, that picture of what's happening on the ground. So I think this leaves us in a really good place to close off the panel and thinking about, how do we approach these issues in a way that is sensitive towards these communities and also, beneficial to these animal populations. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to our audience. We have another panel scheduled for next month. And it will be on disease and zoonosis threats to smallholder livelihoods. And we will keep you all updated as to our panelist lineup. And hopefully you can join us next time as well. So thank you everyone again, and have a great day or evening ahead wherever you are.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, it was nice to meet you all. Good job.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye, Ming Li. Thank you.